Hey, what's up, Wow314? This is Sasan from DVC. I have your question here. Paul posted a video, and I also wanted to be cool and have a video. The other thing is that you asked a great question. You asked for, I mean, so you used to say you want to take it to the next level, so I want to give you some pretty good analysis here, and I could type out everything, but I feel like that might be less clear. Hopefully this video isn't too long. So let's just recap your question. What's the best way to do impact calc? For the longest time, I feel as if I briefly explain my impact and throw out a few buzzwords: probability, magnitude, time frame. Yeah, classic. A lot of people say actually compare impacts, but what does that really mean? And what does that look like? Any detailed advice? Okay, great. What I wish I could do is pull up a round and show it to you, but digging around for a round that is public forum and does this well and all that stuff might take a really long time, so I'll be talking a little bit in abstractions. But hopefully I'll be able to give you some pretty solid examples. So here's what I'm going to talk to you about. Role of impacts, quantifying and qualifying. You'll know what those words mean soon. 4 questions. It's a little shortcut to how to write good impacts. And then a couple more buzzwords instead of just time frame, probability, magnitude to help you out. Alright, role of impacts. Role of impacts is to help you, well, to allow the judge to compare arguments. So here's something that we hear a lot in debate. We hear the term good argument, and almost no one will ever tell you what that actually means. They'll say something was a good argument or something is not a good argument without any real explanation of what sort of criteria something has to meet in order to be a good argument. Well, I'm about to give it to you. Here is what makes a good argument. A good argument is true and it's important. And it has to be both of those things. Now, the true part is a little bit more obvious, and it's something that I think a lot of debaters instinctively focus a lot on, and most of their cases just warrants and stuff, right? You read the evidence, you're like, oh, all of this is true, and then the debate goes on and you're just sort of reading your warrants back and forth to each other. The other aspect of what makes an argument good is how important it is, and this is something that's like really undercovered, I think, especially in public forum, where sometimes impact arguments are like one sentence. Now, everything you say in a debate should be with the goal of either 1, getting you to an impact, or 2, stopping your opponent from getting to their impacts. Now, you would think, yeah, there's some exceptions to this, but really, at the end of the day, there aren't as many exceptions as you would think. Like, even definitions or framework, like things like that, those don't make any difference if they don't affect the impacts, right? This is something that I talked about with somebody else who asked me annoying things in public forum, and I was like, when the negative reads their own criteria or their own framework, when it makes no difference. Like, if your impacts affect both criteria just the same, then it's a waste of time to read it. So everything you say in a debate should be with this in mind. Judges vote on impacts. Here's how a judge makes a decision. Judges decide, and I hear a lot about like high school and middle school debate, like judges not judging well. I'm still going to say this is going to be the vast majority. Decide the winner by thinking which argument had the biggest impact, who won that argument. Now, I think in the video Paul posted, I didn't watch it, though I have seen it before, he talks about like winning by 1, right? Which talks a lot about this. But in order to really get into this, yeah, you need to have a big impact. So to basically summarize everything Paul was saying earlier is you can have one argument, and if that is the most important argument in the round, all you have to do is prove that it's true. What makes it important? The impacts. Great, we're kind of going in circles now, so let's talk about how to write impacts. So impacts have to have two aspects to them. So the whole point is to make comparisons, right? So what you want is to allow your argument to be compared to your opponent's arguments, even though they might not be talking about the same thing. Well, first we're going to talk about quantifying. Quantifying. This does is it makes your impacts similar or comparable to similar impacts. So what does this mean? What does quantify mean? Quantify means make it measurable. What do we mean by that? Literally just use numbers. So we could be talking about a lot of different things here, right? So let's talk about poverty, right? There's a lot of different numbers that we could possibly be talking about and you could possibly use, right? Like, how many people are in poverty now? How many people will go into poverty if the thing you're talking about happens? I'm not going to write that whole. How much poverty will people go into? And then there's all sorts of magnitude questions, or even like probability questions, right? Like, what is the likelihood of ever getting out of poverty once you're in? These are all things that you can use numbers to quantify, make comparisons. But this is poverty is one thing, right? But econ impacts are infuriating when they don't have quantification. Like, how much money are we talking about? Okay, so you say like, oh, if we do this thing, I don't know, you're doing public forum, what's it, Unclose right now? Oh, we're able to do drilling and that helps the economy. Like, how much? How much money does it give us? How many people will that money benefit, etc., right? Get a number. The reason why is, let's say I'm a judge, right? And I am trying to make a decision in a round. What happens is I'm going to be looking at two sides of the debate. I have the AF on the left, the neg on the right, and the AF has a bunch of impacts, right? And they say econ up, they say something like war less likely, and then let's say they have some other impact that's like what is a terrible impact? People will feel better. We'll go into why that's a terrible impact. But now let's get over here. Let's say the other side, right, has contentions that say this costs the U.S. money, increases tensions with other countries. Great. Now, the way a round usually goes is the affirmative team will spend 60% of their time talking about this argument, 30% of their time talking about this argument, and maybe 10% of their time talking about this, right? And the negative will similarly talk a ton about this and a ton about that. But these arguments, this argument here and this argument here, unless those have numbers on them, they're a wash. A wash is when two opposite impacts happen. Now, All the time in econ arguments, something will cost money and something will also give you money. That's how like economy works, right? But if I don't have direct analytics measuring how much money is gained and how much money is lost, I don't have any actual way of saying whether it's a net increase or net decrease. So when a wash happens, a judge has to make a complicated decision. Now, you don't want judges to make a complicated decision. Judges don't want to make complicated decisions. They want to make simple decisions. They want to feel confident in the decision that they're making and feel like they're not going to have to like explain why they picked that to some angry debater. But beyond that, anytime you ask a judge to make a complicated decision, you're inherently making it so that their decision's less predictable. You don't want the judge to be unpredictable. You want the judge to make predictable conclusions, to draw predictable conclusions that you are sort of guiding them towards. So this is not good. But if you quantify this, if you like give me these numbers, then yeah, we gain $10 billion and we lose $1 billion. Sounds like it's a net gain. I vote on the economy improving. That's a very clear way of comparing impacts. The other thing is if you give a specific number and the other side doesn't give a number, I'm always going to prefer the number, even if the other side says, oh, well, it's a lot of money. Like, unless they have analytics that says it's going to cost, like, directly create an economic collapse, then you having a number and them not having a number is all I need in order to vote for you. I want to reward you for giving me the clearer, easier vote. The other thing about that is that this is actually a studied thing. It's some bias I forget the name of, but the idea is that people, it's like it's the devil you know, right? Like when people are gambling, people will take choices that they like know specific things about over more mysterious choices, even if they sort of have a sense that their odds are better with the other. So if it's like, oh, this is going to cost the United States some money, and even if that general analysis is good, if that doesn't have specific numbers, people are going to be more attracted to gaining the amount of money specifically that you talked about. Why? Probably because it's easier for them to rationalize what that money can be used for. And like what that number really means. Here's the other thing with a wash. If I have a bunch of arguments and both teams tell me this is the most important thing, but it's a wash and I have no real way of comparing it, my brain's just going to go to the next thing. I'm just going to be like, nope, what's an easier place I can decide? War is less likely. This means war is more likely. So again, we have another wash here. But oh, look, we have this one argument that has nothing against it, so it's not a wash, and I don't have enough analysis telling me this isn't true, or that it's, is it that important? I don't know, but it's a simple decision, so I'm probably going to vote here, honestly, if I'm a judge and I have nothing else to go on. You don't want that. You want them to like the argument you spent the most time talking about. So don't let your arguments wash. Use specific analytics with quantified, measurable numbers. Now, not every sense of being measurable always means numbers, but just make it measurable so that you can compare it to similar impacts. Next, let's talk about qualifying. What qualifying does is makes dissimilar impacts comparable. And basically what you're doing here is advocate for a hierarchy of impacts in which yours is higher than theirs, and then we'll correct the spelling of hierarchy. Right, so this is where you get arguments like this kind of impact is more important than that kind of impact. And then why? Usually you want to justify this in some way, and there's several ways to justify it. One of the easiest and one of the most sort of fundamental ways is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a hierarchy of impacts. Now, up is not good in this case in terms of importance. If you're not familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's pretty straightforward. Maslow was a psychologist, and he decided, okay, of all the things that people want, what is the sort of order of importance? So, like, yeah, people want a feeling of self-esteem, but if they had to pick between having a self-esteem and not being on fire, they most likely would pick not being on fire. And yeah, you can always think of, like, people who've made sacrifices for their respect or honor and things like that, but generally speaking, human beings don't tend to be concerned with issues of friendship when they have no, like, food or water. So the way this works is the lower a impact is, like the more fundamentally it affects the needs of a human being, the easier it is to argue that something is more important than something else. And this is why impacts like this makes people like the government more aren't that aren't great, because, like, what is that? That is like uh, belonging. Like, what? It's not all that fundamental in basic needs. Another way to think about it is, if I wake up tomorrow and your impact has happened to me, would I notice? And it's shocking how often the answer to that is no when you look at people's cases, right? Like, you want something that would be viscerally and fundamentally important and noticeable in terms of a change, or something, whether it's positive or negative, right? But something like, oh, people will have more freedom of speech. Like, if I wake up tomorrow and I have more freedom of speech, like, would I notice? Another thing is with really vague impacts, right? Like quality of life. What does that mean? Quality of whose life? In what instances, right? A great question you can ask to test whether something like quality of life is a good impact or not is, was the quality of life in the United States higher or lower 5 years ago? Or you can change that number. I don't know, last year, 6 months ago, 2 days ago, last week. The idea is, this is a hard question for people to answer, because it usually people will need to look at analysis and data and statistics. And the point is, if you can't tell by having lived through this whether things have been getting worse or better, then how can you possibly argue that it's a huge, significant impact, right? Probably can't, right? If you need a statistical analysis to know if it's happened, it's probably not the strongest impact. So basically, you want to pick a way to just say why your impact has a fundamentally more significant effect on someone's life than their sort of impact. Now, this will mean, like, this will be something like death versus let's not voter confidence, right? Where you just say, like, fundamentally death is more significant than voter confidence. And so you're not comparing the amount of death versus the amount of voter confidence. You're just saying, look, any death is not worth a gain in voter confidence. Any amount of death is not worth a gain in money, or whatever the case may be. Maybe you argue the opposite, but you want to make the case, right? You can say voter confidence is more important and give me liberty or whatever. But you want to make that case. That's basically quantifying and qualifying. Let's sort of get down to what another way of looking at impacts. Another way of looking at impacts is that they are the answer to the question, Why is that important? And this is basically a foundational question in the field of ethics, right? Ethics is the answer to the question, what should we do? So anytime we're trying to make some sort of decision, we ask, well, why is that important? And pick an impact, and then just sort of keep asking this question until you hit bottom. And we'll sort of take a look at what that looks like. Voter confidence. Let's use that example. Voter confidence. Why is that important? Because improving voter confidence improves the faith in the government. Why is that important? Because the faith in the government, excuse me, makes it so that you are more active in democracy because you have faith in it and stuff like that. Why is democracy important? Democracy is important because it protects rights. Why are rights important? Because without rights, people would have violence committed against them. Why is violence bad? Because violence causes physical harm and psychological harm. Why is that important? Because harm is close to death or leads to it. Why is that important? Because death is bad. And the fact of the matter is, in most models of ethics that anyone uses nowadays, we really haven't figured it out any better than death is bad. Now, there's arguments out there for why death is not bad, and sometimes you could hear that in a debate round, but they're not terribly persuasive, especially in the context of something like public forum, because your job is to convince a debate judge, especially in public forum, if they're not super experienced debaters and love gamey debate, they're probably going to agree death is bad. And you can do this with any impact. You follow it down long enough, you're probably going to get to that death is bad. So here's a little bit of a shortcut for how to write a good impact. Now, it sort of accomplishes qualification because it immediately assumes that you can make the argument that death is more important than whatever else, and it kind of quantifies it by focusing on what on the numbers. So these are the 4 questions. So if you can answer these 4 questions about your contentions, you should end up with strong impacts. Really, the first 3 are the most important. But let's see, 4 questions. 1. Who dies? Now, if you are advocating for a change, you want to say who is dying right now, or would die if we don't do something, and how you prevent that. Otherwise, if you are advocating against a change, you want to talk about who that change kills. And here you want to be specific, right? You don't want to just say Americans or innocent people. Be extremely specific to whatever degree you can. What ethnic group of people are most affected by this? What region of the country is most affected by this? What economic group is most affected by this? People in what sort of health? Depending on whatever the issue is, be specific. Because the next question is, how many of these people are there? Now, that's a distinct question from how many of these people will die. The reason for that is because those numbers are really hard to get good cards on. You're not going to find a very good card that says, here's how many people would die if this incredibly specific scenario that you have just decided to write an argument about happens. But once you explain what group of people is affected by this, you just say how many of those people there are. So, for example, if we were talking about, like, I don't know, if we're talking about this was last year and we're talking about North Korea, you need to say that this affects 24 million citizens in North Korea. And at that point, if they have some sort of argument and the number that they're talking about is smaller than 24 million, you have won that impact comparison. And it's always a game between trying to get a really big impact, but also having a strong enough warrant that you're convincingly winning it. Again, that's the balance between keeping your argument true and important, right? Question number 3. How do these people die? Just explain how the scenario you're talking about kills people, because sometimes people just really aren't clear about that, and that's the sort of thing I would challenge. And sort of the fourth, how soon will they die? So, let's say we're talking about climate change. So, who dies from climate change? Well, probably people living in poverty. And off the top of my head, that number I think is 30 million in the United States. Well, that would be question number 2. People dying in poverty and people living in areas near the coast. How many of these people are there? I'm sure there's a card that talks about this, right? And I'm also sure that there's a card that talks about what groups of people are most affected by climate change. Let's say there's 30 million of these. There's, I don't know, actually a lot of people live on the coast. Probably like 100 million. But I don't know. This is just a number I'm throwing out. Great. 130 million. How do they die? Crop failures, rising water. Cool. How soon will they die? This is probably where the climate change argument is on the weaker side, right? Like, I don't know, 50 years. That's not a huge number, but you can sort of see where it's doing really hot and where it's like, oof, that's not so strong. And you would do that with any argument that you have, right? You want to just answer these 4 questions. Who dies? What happens here? And if your argument just doesn't have good answers to these questions, it's probably not a very good argument. And this is why when you're making debate arguments, you don't want to just make whatever argument the literature is talking about, because the way the literature about a topic is written is not to predict the biggest sort of consequence that could be related to this. That's sort of not what those authors are focused on. So a lot of times, your analysis won't focus on that at all. Like, for example, the H1B topic, one of the arguments that Paul and I were writing for that was that this makes, like, Ebola outbreaks that are currently happening in Africa way harder to manage because doctors get taken out of those areas and blah, 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 right? You'd have to read a lot of H1B literature before the word Ebola ever comes up, if ever, right? But we don't need that. We just need to say, like, they take doctors out of Africa, and then a separate card that says, right now there is Ebola in Zimbabwe, and then a separate impact card of, like, okay, here's who dies from Ebola. Here's how many people are in these affected area. Here's how many people died the previous time Ebola happened. And that kind of brings me to another point. Precedence is king. Well, let's make that non-gendered. Precedence is monarch. Basically, like, if you are saying something will happen, if you can show me that that thing has happened before, that, one, makes it way more likely that it could happen again, but two, also frames how important it could be. This is also a really good way of answering impacts. Like, if they say something is gonna happen, if you can show that thing happened before and it wasn't that big a deal, really good impact mitigation there. Right. Cool. So what's the last thing we're going to talk about here? How long is this video? Impact calc. Okay, I'm going to throw a couple more options out there other than just magnitude, time frame, and probability. First, I'm going to split magnitude into two. I like to do this. You would still call it magnitude and round most likely, but I think this helps keep in your own head how you should be talking about this. So the first is scope. And the second is severity. Scope is the number of people affected, and the severity is significance of the effect. That should be somewhat clear already if you've been doing debate and you sort of have already been using the language of magnitude before. Next is probability, and again, probability is way higher when you argue for something with precedence. So in your impact, if you can just like read a card of the last time something like this happened, what the effects of it were, and then elaborate on like what's at stake now, how many people would be affected, that is going to make the strongest case for probability most likely. It's going to be really hard comparatively to find detailed cards describing the specifics of a thing that's never happened. Next, of course, time frame. Yeah, this is all cool. We're gonna throw a couple more onto here. The first is reversibility. Reversibility argues that impact A is more well, I'm just gonna say A. A is more important than B because A is less reversible. What does that mean? Reversible means that the effects of it can be undone, whether that's positive or negative. For example, this is a really great way of comparing impacts of death to economics. Say something creates poverty, people can always be taken out of poverty. Now, that's actually harder than it sounds. But yeah, you take somebody's job away, unemployment goes up, unemployment will go back down, right? The same people who lost their jobs can get their jobs again. We're not powerless to fix this impact. But death is not reversible, short of Frankenstein methods. So that makes death a more significant impact because we can't, we'll have no future opportunities to fix this. It's sort of along the lines of time frame mixed in with a little bit of like magnitude and severity and stuff like that, right? But it's a great way of comparing impacts where you might sometimes not be winning strictly by the numbers, but you have a case for why the quality of your impact is higher than your opponent's, and that's because it's less reversible. Sometimes this is also called irreversibility or whatever. This one is a little harder to put a name on, and this is